You ever notice the city don't breathe the same when something bad's about to happen? That night, even the rats were keeping quiet. It was the kind of silence that didn't belong to New York, not my New York. The streets always had a hum, a pulse, the clatter of shoes, the hiss of a steam vent, the far-off moan of a tugboat on the East River. But that night, in the spring of '31, the air hung heavy, like the whole city was holding its breath, waiting for something ugly to walk through the door. I remember standing on the corner of Delancey and Christie, my back to a brick wall still warm from the day's sun, even though the rain had just started. My hat brim caught the drops, rolling them down past my collar. I lit a lucky strike, watched the match flare up in the wind. That tiny bit of light felt out of place, like I was giving away my position. Even then, I wasn't nervous. No, nervous gets you sloppy. And sloppy gets you dead. I was calm, same way you'd be calm sitting at a card table holding 4 aces. The Lower East Side was my old stomping ground. I knew the smell of it, wet cobblestone, onions frying in some back kitchen, stale beer seeping out from a saloon's side door. I knew the sound of it, the click of a shopkeeper's lock, the rustle of laundry strung across fire escapes. But that night, the familiar had gone strange. I could feel eyes. Not the eyes of the people who worked for me, or the ones who owed me, no, these were the eyes that measured the distance from your back to a brick wall, the kind that wondered how easy you'd go down. I took my time walking toward the little cafe on the corner. It wasn't much to look at from the outside, just a couple old greasy windows and a faded awning. But inside, that place had heard more whispered deals than a Wall Street boardroom. And tonight, it was where I get the last piece of news I needed before setting the whole city on fire. The bell above the door gave a tired jingle when I stepped in. The air hit me warm, thick with cigar smoke and the faint tang of espresso. There was a hum of low voices, the scrape of a chair leg. A radio in the back was mumbling some slow Italian ballad. The boys at the front tables gave me a nod, nothing more. In our world, too much attention was bad business. I walked past them straight to the back booth where the shadows were thickest. My shoes didn't make a sound on the worn wood floor. I slid into the booth and kept my hat on. A man keeps his hat on in certain places, for certain reasons. Across from me was Benny Two Keys Marino, a kid who got his name from always carrying 2 things, a ring of lockpicks and a piano key from his old man's busted upright. Benny was all jumping knees and darting eyes, like a rabbit that knew it was being hunted. "You're late, Charlie," he said, barely moving his lips. "I'm alive," I told him. "That's never late." He slid an envelope across the table, just far enough for my fingertips. Inside were names, the kind of names that, if you whispered 'em in the wrong room, you didn't walk out. "These are the ones sitting down with Masuria tomorrow," he said. "Private meet. No outsiders." I took my time looking through the list, letting the names sink in. "You sure?" I asked. Benny swallowed. "I ain't guessing, Charlie. I was in the room next door." I didn't say much after that. In this life, when you get handed the last piece of a puzzle, you don't celebrate. You think. You measure. You make sure you know which way the blood's gonna flow before you spill it. The rain outside picked up, tapping against the windows in quick, sharp beats. People came and went, their coats glistening under the weak cafe light. I kept my eyes on the door, watching for anyone lingering too long, anyone whose shoes stayed planted when they should have kept moving. That's when I saw him, a shadow from the street, leaning on the lamppost across the way. He was watching the cafe, and I could feel it. "Benny," I said, my voice low, "you go out the back. Tell nobody you saw me. If they ask where you were tonight, you were homesick." Benny didn't argue. He just slid out of the booth and disappeared toward the kitchen, his shoulders tight. I sat there a minute longer, letting the moment stretch, letting whoever was outside think I wasn't going anywhere. Then I dropped a couple coins on the table, finished my coffee, and stood. When I stepped back into the rain, the lamppost was empty. Just a wet street, glistening under the flicker of a streetlight. Thing is, in our business, absence is sometimes louder than presence. Whoever had been watching me wasn't there anymore, which meant they were somewhere else, thinking about their next move. I pulled my coat tighter and started down the block. The air smelled sharper now, cleaner after the rain. My footsteps echoed, and for a second, I thought I caught the faintest rhythm of another pair behind me. But when I stopped, the sound stopped too. That's when I smiled. The game was already in motion. And the city still hadn't taken a breath. People think you're born a gangster. Nah. You get made by the streets, or you get eaten by 'em. I wasn't born in New York. My story started a long way from the lights, the noise, and the smell of hot pretzels on a winter corner. I came from a place where the streets were dust and the air smelled of olives and salt from the sea, a little village in Sicily where the mountains looked like they'd been watching for centuries, keeping their secrets. My old man worked the fields, breaking his back for a handful of coins. My ma, she kept the house, cooked with whatever she could stretch into a meal, beans, bread, and sometimes, if we were lucky, a scrap of meat. Life was simple. And by simple, I mean poor. The kind of poor that teaches you early the difference between need and want. But even in that tiny place, you could feel the shadow of something bigger. Men in dark suits who didn't work the fields, who never seemed hungry. They'd walk through town like they owned the dirt we stood on. Folks stepped aside, eyes down. Nobody said the word mafia out loud, but we all knew it, same way you know a storm's coming by the smell in the air. Then came the decision, the one my father said would change everything. We were going to America. L'America, he called it, like it was some magic word that could fill a belly and put shoes on your feet. The trip across the Atlantic was no cruise. We were packed into the belly of a ship, the air thick with the smell of sweat, sickness, and fear. People clung to their bundles, praying they hadn't traded one kind of misery for another. When we stepped onto Ellis Island, the sky over New York looked bigger than anything I'd ever seen. The buildings reached higher than the mountains back home, but they didn't watch over you, they swallowed you. The streets were loud, alive, and mean. Men shouted in a dozen languages, trolleys clanged, and somewhere a barrel organ cranked out a tune I didn't know yet. We ended up on the Lower East Side, in a tenement that smelled like cabbage and coal dust. You could hear the neighbors through the thin walls, arguments, lullabies, and the steady cough of somebody who wasn't gonna make it through winter. My father found work unloading ships down at the docks, my mother sewed piecework for pennies. And me? I found the streets. The streets were my school, and the lessons were quick. You learned which blocks were safe to walk, which alleys to avoid, and whose name to never say unless you wanted trouble. I picked up English from the kids I ran with, though half the words were curses. We played stickball with broom handles, hustled pennies from bottle returns, and when we were old enough to be noticed, we found out what real money looked like. There were gangs, Irish, Jewish, Italian. They didn't mix much, but everybody respected strength. You showed weakness, you got chewed up. That's when I met Meyer Lansky. Skinny kid, sharp as a straight razor. First time we talked, he cleaned me out in a street dice game and I didn't even mind. I admired the nerve. He wasn't Italian, but he understood the same rule I did, the game wasn't about luck. It was about control. We started running small-time scams together, selling hot watches that barely ticked, moving crates off the docks that didn't belong to us, setting up card games where the deck was always in our favor. Every job taught us something new, how to spot a tail, how to read a man's face, how to make him think you were doing him a favor even as you cleaned him out. But it wasn't just about making money. It was about building a reputation. In the neighborhood, word traveled fast. You wanted your name to mean two things: you delivered, and you didn't fold under pressure. I kept my nose clean enough that the cops didn't bother too much, but dirty enough that the right people started to notice. Sometimes I'd walk past the fancy uptown joints and look in the windows, men in tailored suits, cigars thick as your thumb, women in furs. I wasn't jealous. I was talking notes. Those guys weren't better than me. They just had more time in the game. and I was catching up. Every so often, I'd think about Sicily, the hills, the quiet, the smell of my mother's bread. But the Lower East Side had its own rhythm, and I was starting to hear the beat. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about climbing. The city didn't hand you ladders, you built your own, one rung at a time, usually out of someone else's wood. By the time I was a teenager, I wasn't just another immigrant kid looking for work. I was a name people knew, a kid who could get things done. And Meyer? He was my right hand, the one guy I trusted to watch my back and keep his mouth shut. We were just getting started, but I could already see the bigger picture. New York was a machine, and the streets were the gears. If you learned how to work they'd take you anywhere you wanted to go. If you didn't, well, you'd end up another body in the river, your name forgotten by Monday. Meyer wasn't big, but his brain, that was something else. Together, we could turn nickels into 20s before lunch. Meyer wasn't big, but his brain, that was something else. He had this way of seeing the angles before the game even started. Me? I had the connections, the charm, the kind of smile that could get a guy to hand over his wallet and thank me for the privilege. Together, we could turn nickels into 20s before lunch, and by dinner, we'd be wearing those 20s in our suit pockets like pocket squares. Back then, we were kings of the sidewalk, not in the way the papers talk about kings. No crowns, no castles. Our kingdom was a few crooked blocks in the Lower East Side, with storefront awnings for shade and alleys for escape routes. The pavement was our throne, and every corner was a piece of territory worth fighting for. We started with street games. Dice on the curb, 3-card Monte on a crate, anything that made the day's pay come quicker. But it wasn't just about run-in games, it was about managing them. We made sure no one else set up shop on our corner without paying for the privilege. And if someone thought they could outplay us, Meyer would hustle them so fast they'd leave wondering if they'd even brought money in the first place. Of course, the sidewalk wasn't empty. Every block had its own crew: Irish boys on Hester Street, tough Jewish kids from Orchard, the older Italian outfits work in Mulberry. Turf wasn't just claimed, it was tested every day. You walked through the wrong patch without permission, you might not walk back out. We learned diplomacy the hard way. Sometimes you smoothed things over with a bottle of whiskey and a cut of the take. Sometimes you made an example. I wasn't looking for blood, but I wasn't afraid to spill it if it meant keeping order. And in our little kingdom, order meant me and Meyer calling the shots. One job that sticks in my mind happened on a gray afternoon. A guy named Short Sal, called that 'cause he barely cleared 5 feet, decided he didn't like our operation running a dice game near his cousin's pawn shop. He sent 2 of his boys to talk to us. They showed up, hands in their coats, trying to look mean. I leaned back against the wall, smiled at them, and said, "You boys look lost. Need directions to the unemployment line?" They didn't laugh. Meyer didn't either. He just stepped forward, quiet as ever, and started explaining the math, how our cut was fair, how Short Sal would actually make more money letting us run the corner than trying to take it himself. When they still didn't bite, I took a different approach. Sometimes talking don't work. Sometimes you gotta send a message that don't need words. A quick shove into a trash barrel, a reminder that concrete feels harder when your face meets it, and suddenly the deal made sense to him. They left with a handshake and a warning to tell Sal to stick to his pawn tickets. That was the rhythm of the sidewalk: a little sugar, a little muscle. Too much of either, and things got messy. But balanced right? You could run a dozen games, move goods from the docks, skim a little from every hustle without anyone raising too much noise. We started seeing bigger opportunities. A guy named Mo the Mixer ran a delivery racket. He could get anything from cigars to silk dresses from uptown into the neighborhood without paying the proper duties. We cut a deal with him, off-errand protection in exchange for a piece of the action. Pretty soon, our pockets were heavier, our suits were cleaner, and the local cops were getting their envelopes regular. Not that the cops were a problem, so long as they stayed bought. Back then, a handshake and a few bills could make a night's trouble disappear. But you had to be careful, give too much and they owned you, give too little and they'd find a reason to toss you in a cell. Meyer was a genius at keeping the balance, remembering birthdays, sending holiday baskets, making sure no one ever felt shorted. We were still small-time compared to the real bosses uptown, but we knew how to make ourselves look bigger than we were. You show up in a nice suit, you buy the first round, you speak like you've already made it, people believe it. Perception's half the game. And yet, even as we climbed, the streets reminded us they were dangerous. One summer night, a stick-up crew from Brooklyn tried to hit one of our games. They came in swinging bats and holding pistols like they'd never fired M. Bad mistake. We'd posted a lookout, and by the time they made it to the table, our boys were already in motion. Fists, chairs, whatever was at hand, they left limping, minus the money they thought they were tucking. Word spread fast after that. But success draws eyes, and not all of them friendly. The older Italian outfits started watching us closer. Guys like Joe Masuria didn't take kindly to young punks carving out slices of the pie without permission. That's when Meyer and I started thinking longer term. Playing the sidewalk was fine, but the real money, the real power, was in the rooms where the street bosses met, smoked cigars, and decided who lived and who didn't. We started making connections. Not just with Italians, but with the Jewish mobs, the Irish crews, even a couple of uptown fixers who moved in political circles. Every handshake was an investment, every shared drink a deposit in a bank we planned to cash in later. Looking back, those days felt almost simple. Sure, we had fights, scams, and close calls, but the stakes were smaller. The air felt lighter. We could walk down the block and know every face, every door, every alley that led to safety. We didn't yet realize that the higher you climb, the fewer friends you got and the more dangerous the ones you keep become. Still, I can't help but smile when I think about it, me and Meyer, standing on the corner like we owned the pavement, pockets full, eyes on the horizon. We didn't know it yet, but the sidewalk was just our training ground. The real game, the one that would change everything, was about to start. You wanna run this city? First, you gotta bury the old rules and the men who wrote them. You wanna run this city? First, you gotta bury the old rules and the men who wrote them. By the early 30s, me and Meyer weren't just sidewalk kings anymore. We had money, respect, and something even more important, options. But the city was changing. The little street hustles were still there, sure, but the real action, the real power, sat in backrooms thick with cigar smoke, where bosses shook hands over territory lines and sent men to their graves with a nod. At the top of that food chain sat two names, Joe the Boss Masuria and Salvatore Maranzano. They didn't just run crews, they ran armies. And they hated each other with a passion that could light the city on fire. The newspapers called it the Castellammarese War, but for the guys in the life, it was more like an earthquake. Everything shook, cracks opened up, and you either found your footing or got swallowed whole. Masuria had the old-school Italian thing down pat, loyalty only to your own kind, heavy tribute, no mixing with other ethnic crews. Maranzano, on the other hand, wanted to bring a little Roman Empire into the mix, military-style ranks, iron discipline, him sitting on top like Caesar. The trouble was, neither one of them understood what the new city really needed. They were fighting for a past that was already dying. Me? I wasn't sentimental. The streets taught me that survival ain't about tradition, it's about adaptation. And the future I saw didn't have room for two aging bulls locking horns while the young bloods waited their turn. So I played both sides. With Masuria, I kept the smile wide, the envelope thick. I made him think I was his man, a loyal soldier who'd bleed for him. With Maranzano, I played the smart young visionary who saw the old ways as a dead end. Both of them bought it, or maybe they just wanted to believe it. That's the thing about powerful men, they hear what they want to hear. The war was getting bloody. Drive-bys in the middle of the day, bodies dumped in alleys like yesterday's trash. Guys I'd known since I was a kid were vanishing overnight. Every sit-down felt like sitting on a powder keg, everyone smiling with their hands under the table where the guns were. One night, Meyer and I were in a back room over on 2nd Avenue, looking over a map of the city. We had pins for every crew, lines for supply routes, dots for where hits had gone down. "Charlie," Meyer said, "this ain't sustainable. They'll wipe each other out, and we'll be standin' in the rubble. Unless," I said, "we decide who's left standin'." That was the first time I said it out loud, the thought that had been sittin' in the back of my head for months. If Masuria was gone, Maranzano would win. And if Maranzano won, I could deal with him at least for a while. From then on, it was all about positionin'. I made sure Masuria trusted me more than ever, took on risky jobs, delivered bigger takes, fed him just enough information about Maranzano to keep him hungry. At the same time, I kept Maranzano convinced I was just waiting for the right moment to throw in with him. I was walking a razor's edge, but that's where I've always been most comfortable. There was one meeting I'll never forget. Masuria called a sit-down in a little apartment in Brooklyn. The place smelled like garlic and gun oil. He sat at the head of the table, hands folded, eyes squinting through the smoke. "Charlie," he said, "I hear you've been talking to the Castellamaries." I leaned forward, smiled just enough to look confident but not cocky. "Joe, I talk to a lot of people. You pay me to know what's going on. That's what I'm doing." He stared at me for a long time, then nodded. "Good. 'Cause if I ever thought you were with them, you wouldn't walk out that door." I walked out that door. And the minute I hit the street, I knew the clock was ticking. Masuria's paranoia was growing, and sooner or later, I'd end up on his list unless I got to him first. It wasn't about hate. It was business. Masuria's time had come, and I was gonna make sure it ended in a way that put me exactly where I wanted to be, sitting across from Maranzano, talking about the future like we were the only two men in the city who understood it. The thing about a war like that is, everyone's so focused on winning the next battle they don't see the guy in the middle collecting the spoils. I wasn't fighting for Masuria or Maranzano, I was fighting for Luciano. And every move I made brought me closer to being the man in charge of all of it. The tension was like a wire pulled tight. Every handshake was suspect, every look across the table carried weight. I kept my crew close, my gun closer, and my mind on the next step, the dinner that would end an era. By the time the plan was in place, the city was so deep in blood, one more body wouldn't raise an eyebrow. The hard part wasn't the kill, it was what came after, making sure the vacuum didn't suck me under before I could fill it. That's the thing nobody tells you about power, it ain't the talking that's hard, it's the keepin'. And in this city, the only way to keep it is to make sure nobody's left to take it from you. If you're gonna betray a king, make sure you're the one pouring his wine. If you're gonna betray a king, make sure you're the one pouring his wine. By the spring of '31, Joe Masuria's empire wasn't an empire anymore. It was a crumbling castle, cracks in the walls, rats in the pantry, and a king who couldn't tell his friends from his enemies. Trouble was, I was both. The war with Maranzano had drained him. Every week it was another funeral, another envelope of cash spent on bribes, another soldier who vanished into the East River. And the more it bled him, the more suspicious he got. I knew the look in his eyes, like a man searching for snakes in the grass even while one was wrapped around his neck. That snake was me. The plan was simple, but simple don't mean easy. We'd set up a dinner, just the two of us, in a little joint out in Coney Island. I'd make it look like a peace talk, like I was still his man to the bone. Meanwhile, a crew of hitters would be waiting outside. When the time was right, I'd step out, light a cigarette, and they'd come in. Problem was, Masuria wasn't stupid. Paranoid, yes. Old school, absolutely. But stupid? Not in the slightest. One wrong move at that table and I'd be the one leaving in a canvas bag. The day of, the sky was low and gray, like it was keeping its own secrets. I wore my best suit, the navy one with the thin pinstripes. If I was gonna kill the boss, I was gonna look like a gentleman doing it. The restaurant was quiet, just the clink of cutlery and the faint sound of waves outside. Masuria was already there when I walked in, sitting at a corner table with his back to the wall. Always the cautious one. He had a deck of cards in front of him, shuffling slow like time was his to waste. "Charlie," he said, nodding at the chair across from him. "Sit. We play a few hands, we talk. Maybe today we make sense of this war." I smiled like I believed him. "That's why I'm here, Joe." We ordered wine. Red. Good stuff. I poured for him first, respect always. He talked about how Maranzano was a snake, how the war was almost over, how he needed young men like me to carry the torch. I nodded in the right places, laughed at the right jokes. But every tick of the clock brought us closer to the point of no return. Halfway through the meal, I gave the signal. Just a casual line about stepping out for a smoke. I reached into my pocket, not for my gun, but for the silver lighter Meyer had given me. My hand was steady. My heart? Not so much. Outside, the air smelled like salt and gun oil. I flicked the lighter once, twice, the flame dancing in the wind. That was the cue. The hitters moved fast, Benny, Vito, and a kid named Joe Adonis, all solid, all ready to do what had to be done. They pushed through the door, guns low but ready. Inside, the sound was muffled, like the city was holding its breath. Then the crack of the first shot. And another. And another. Through the window, I saw Masuria jerk back in his chair, cards scattering across the table like white birds taking flight. His wine glass toppled, red spilling across the linen like a wound. It was over in seconds. The king was dead, and the castle had no walls left. I didn't go back inside. No point. The hitters would clean it up, make it look like just another mob hit in a city that was numb to M. I lit a real cigarette this time, the smoke curling up into that gray sky. On the ride back into the city, I kept thinking about the look on his face in that last moment. Not fear. Not even anger. Just surprise, like he'd finally realized the game he'd been playing had another player all along. By nightfall, the word was out. Joe Masuria was gone, and Maranzano was the last man standing. The war was over. The papers called it a turning point. They weren't wrong. But what they didn't know was that the war had just gone from bullets to brains. And in that kind of war? I never lose. Maranzano sent word almost immediately, a private meeting, just the two of us. He wanted to thank me, reward me, maybe even bring me in closer. I knew what he was really doing, measuring me, figuring out if I was a threat. And he was right to wonder. See, I didn't kill Masuria to hand the city over to another old man with a crown. I killed him to make room. Room for something new. Something bigger. Something I could control. That night, sitting in my apartment with a glass of whiskey, I thought about the future. About the commission I'd been dreaming up, a table where every boss had a seat, where wars like this never had to happen again. A place where business came first and blood came last. It was gonna take time. It was gonna take patience. And yeah, it was gonna take more blood. But for the first time in years, I could see the whole board. And I was sitting right in the middle of it. Masuria's last dinner wasn't just the end of a war. It was the start of my reign. The problem with lions is they forget foxes got teeth too. The problem with lions is they forget foxes got teeth too. With Masuria gone, Salvatore Maranzano was sitting pretty, the last man standing. The newspapers called him the boss of bosses, and he liked the sound of it so much, he started using it himself. He walked around like a king in exile who'd just taken back his throne. Tall, sharp nose, eyes that never blinked too long, the man had presence, I'll give him that. He ran his affairs with the kind of discipline you'd expect from someone who read Julius Caesar more than the racing form. He loved those old Roman stories, saw himself as some kind of Caesar in pinstripes. And like Caesar, he wanted the whole empire under his thumb. Our first meeting after Masuria's death was in his office, big, quiet, and clean. No smoke, no noise. Just Maranzano behind his desk, fingers steepled like he was praying. He poured me a glass of Chianti and smiled that thin-lipped smile of his. "Charlie," he said, "you have done the city a great service. From this day, there will be peace." I smiled back, but inside, I was Logan. Peace? This man was already counting the days before he turned his gun on me. See, Maranzano had a problem. He thought like a lion, big, proud, territorial. But I was thinking like a fox. I'd seen too many kings fall to trust one who crowned himself. And the more he strutted, the more I realized the city couldn't breathe with him in charge. He reorganized the families, carved up territories like a butcher slicing meat. 5 families in New York, each with a boss, an underboss, and a consigliere. Sound familiar? Yeah, that was my idea. But he kept one thing I didn't like, himself at the top. Boss of bosses. At first, I played the loyal lieutenant. I sent envelopes, showed up to dinners, nodded when he talked about honor and tradition. But behind the scenes, I was building my own network, guys who owed me favors, guys who knew the streets better than Maranzano's old Sicilian crew ever could. Then he made his first mistake, he started listening to whispers. The kind of whispers that said I was too ambitious. That maybe I wanted his seat. And the truth? Those whispers weren't wrong. One night, I got word from one of my guys that Maranzano had been meeting with a crew of out-of-town hitmen. Not for just anyone, for me. They were supposed to take me out nice and quiet. No war. Just one fox, skinned and gone. That's when I decided the lion had to go. I called Meyer Lansky and Benny Siegel. Told them it was time. We'd do it quick, clean, no blood in the streets. But here's the twist, we weren't gonna use our own guys. Too risky. Too many people who'd talk. Instead, I brought in some friends from the Irish mob. They didn't look like gangsters, they looked like accountants. Which, in this business, is a better disguise than any mask. The plan was set for September 31st. Maranzano thought he was having a meeting with some taxmen in his office. They'd come in, ask a few questions, maybe look at the books. He wouldn't see it coming until it was too late. The morning of, the city had that crisp fall air, the kind that makes you think of new beginnings. Fitting. I stayed far away, I wasn't about to be anywhere near the scene. Instead, I sat in a little diner downtown, sipping coffee, checking my watch every few minutes. At exactly 2 p.m., the taxmen walked into Maranzano's building. 4 of them. Suits pressed, hats low. They went up to his office and, according to the guy on the inside, Maranzano stood to greet M, probably thinking he was too smart to get caught. The first blade went in fast, under the ribs. The gunshots came after, just to make sure. They didn't leave him breathing. No speeches, no grand gestures. Just another body in a city that buried too many. By 2:15, it was done. The lion was gone. And the fox? Well, the fox was already thinking about the next move. That night, I called a meeting. Not just in New York, bosses from Chicago, Buffalo, Cleveland. No more boss of bosses. From now on, we'd have a commission. Every family got a seat. Disputes got settled at the table, not in the streets. Business first, bullets last. Some people think I did it to avoid bloodshed. Maybe that's half true. But the real reason? Control. You can't control a war, but you can control a table if you own the table. And I did. Maranzano liked to think he was Caesar. And maybe he was. But me? I was the guy holding the knife in the crowd. If you want to run an empire, you don't need a throne, you need a table. If you want to run an empire, you don't need a throne, you need a table. After Maranzano was gone, New York was like a city after a storm, quiet, but with puddles of blood still glistening in the gutters. Everybody was waiting for the next thunderclap. See, in the old days, when a boss got clipped, there was only one outcome: another war. I wanted something different. Something smarter. The boss of bosses idea? Finished. Done. Buried with Maranzano. In its place, I wanted an organization that ran like a corporation where bosses were shareholders, not subjects. So I called for a meeting. Not just New York, I sent word to Chicago, Detroit, Buffalo, Philly, Cleveland. The idea was simple: we sit down face to face and agree on the rules before another bullet gets fired. The meeting took place in a quiet hotel upstate, far from the eyes of cops and reporters. The kind of place where the wallpaper smelled like cigars from 40 years ago. I walked into the room, and every face in there was a power in his own right. Frank Costello, my consigliere, sharp suit, smooth voice, could sell water to a drowning man. Meyer Lansky, numbers genius, quiet as a priest, but with eyes that saw every move before you made it. Benny Bugsy Siegel, handsome, dangerous, always smiling like he knew a joke you didn't. From Chicago, we had Frank Ninney representing Al Capone, who was already sitting in a cell for tax evasion. From Cleveland, Mo Dalitz. From Detroit, the Purple Gang Boys. Even Buffalo sent their top man. I started the meeting with this: gentlemen, we can keep killing each other until there's no one left to collect the money, or we can do business like businessmen. The room stayed quiet. Some of these guys had spent their whole lives climbing to be the top dog. But I wasn't a skinned them to kneel, I was a skinned them to profit. And that? That's a language every man in that room understood. Here's how I laid it out. 1. No boss of bosses. We'd have a table, called the commission, and every major family boss would have a seat. Decisions that affected everyone would be voted on. Majority rules. No one man calls all the shots. 2. Territory is sacred. You don't touch another man's business without permission. You wanna expand? You talk first. You get a yes, you move. You get a no, you stay put. 3. Disputes get handled at the table. No more shooting in the streets over an insult or a piece of turf. We mediate, we negotiate, and if we gotta, we vote. 4. Business comes first. Gambling, booze, dope, unions, whatever brings in money, that's the priority. Personal grudges stay outside the room. I could see some of the old school guys shifting in their chairs. This wasn't the Sicilian way they'd grown up with. Back in Sicily, it was all about loyalty to the padrino, the man of respect. But I wasn't running a Sicilian village. I was running a multi-million-dollar operation in the middle of the biggest city in America. The commission would be our boardroom. Our court. Our insurance policy. Of course, not everybody loved the idea. Some figured it made me too strong. After all, I was the guy who set it up, and everybody knew I had friends in every corner. But here's the thing, they couldn't fight it without looking like they wanted to go back to the old days. And nobody wanted that, not after the Castellamarese War. When we took the first vote, unanimous approval, I knew we'd changed the game. From that day, the commission wasn't just New York. Chicago had a seat. So did Buffalo, Detroit, Cleveland. Over time, other cities got in: New Orleans, Philly, even out west. Every boss who mattered had a place at the table. We set rules for big jobs. You wanted someone important clipped? You brought it to the commission. You wanted to move into a new racket? You got the okay first. It kept the peace most of the time. And peace meant money. Frank Costello worked his political magic, getting judges and cops in our pocket. Meyer handled the finances, laundering through legitimate businesses, setting up investments. Benny kept the Vegas dream alive, planting seeds for casinos that would one day turn desert sand into rivers of cash. The beauty of the system was that it looked like we were all equals. And in a way, we were, as long as nobody forgot who brought the table to the room. I'll tell you something about power: the smartest way to hold it is to make other people feel like they've got it too. You let 'em talk, you let 'em vote, you let 'em think they're calling the shots. Meanwhile, you're the one setting the agenda, passing the envelopes, arranging the deals before the meeting even starts. That was me, the fox at the table full of lions. Over the next few years, the commission became the backbone of organized crime in America. It didn't stop all the violence, nothing ever could, but it kept the wars small, contained, profitable. We weren't fighting for scraps anymore. We were dividend feasts. The cops didn't understand it. They still pictured some boss of bosses giving orders from a smoky backroom. They didn't realize we'd gone corporate. That's the thing about law enforcement, they're always fighting the last war. And while they were chasing ghosts, we were building skyscrapers out of dirty money. By the end of that first year, the books were fatter than ever. Gambling joints, numbers rackets, union kickbacks, speakeasies, all running smooth, all paying tribute, without a single all-out war in sight. The commission wasn't perfect, but it was ours. And for a while, it was beautiful. Every empire needs a capital. Ours just happened to be built in the middle of the desert. Every empire needs a capital. Ours just happened to be built in the middle of the desert. You see, New York was the heartbeat, the money came in there fast and heavy. But Vegas? Vegas was gonna be the crown jewel. Not yet, not in the early 30s. Back then, it was still just a dusty stop on the way to Los Angeles, a couple of gas stations, a train depot, a main street you could cross in 3 strides. But here's what made it interesting: in 1931, Nevada legalized gambling. And you know what legal gambling means? It means the government builds the casino for you, and you don't gotta bribe a single cop to keep it open. Meyer Lansky was the first to bring it to me. He'd been watching the West for years, looking at the numbers coming in from the few joints already running. He lays out the math: minimal heat, high profit, a steady stream of suckers coming in from California with cash in their pockets and dreams in their eyes. Charlie, he says, this ain't just another racket. This is a factory. You don't gotta chase customers, they chase you. Benny Siegel, now Benny was the wild card. Where Meyer saw numbers, Benny saw glamour. He had a vision, not just of some card tables and a bar, but of palaces in the sand. Marble floors, crystal chandeliers, chorus girls, high rollers drinking champagne for breakfast. Benny could sell a dream like nobody else, and Vegas was his blank canvas. The first move wasn't to build. It was to secure the blessing of the commission. See, in this life, you don't just start a new empire without letting the other bosses taste the pie. I put it to the table plain: gentlemen, this ain't about stealing turf. This is about creatine turf. You got a piece of Vegas, you got a piece of the future. Some were cautious. Out west was uncharted territory, and they were creatures of the cities. But Meyer's numbers didn't lie, and the thought of clean, legal gambling money, well, that's a sweet song to any ear. We started small. A few connections with the existing casinos, a couple of silent partnerships where our money backed the operations without our names on the papers. The cash flowed back east quiet as a whisper. But Benny didn't do quiet. By the mid-40s, after the war, he convinced us to go big. He had this idea for a place called the Flamingo. Said it'd be the classiest joint in America, right there in the middle of nowhere. His pitch was something else: people will fly across the country just to stay here. Celebrities, politicians, millionaires, they'll be begging for a room. This place will make the Waldorf look like a flophouse. And you know what? We bit. We gave him the green light. The construction was a circus from day one. Benny had no patience for budgets. If he saw a better chandelier, he bought it. If he wanted marble from Italy, he shipped it in. Costs ballooned like a crooked union payroll. Meyer was pulling his hair out, but Benny kept saying, "Trust me, Charlie. You gotta spend big to make big." Opening night, December 1946, disaster. A rainstorm kept the Hollywood crowd away. The rooms weren't all finished. The casino lost money hand over fist. The papers laughed. The commission wasn't Logan. But Benny, stubborn as ever, kept it open. And little by little, the flamingo started to catch fire. Celebrities showed up. Money started pouring in. Vegas was no longer just a dusty pit stop, it was the playground of the rich and reckless. For me, Vegas was more than profit. It was a statement. It showed the world that we weren't just street toughs and backroom hustlers. We could run legitimate seaman businesses better than the so-called respectable men in their skyscrapers. We could take a desert and make it bloom in neon. Of course, the desert's a strange place. The same sun that makes it shine will burn you alive if you ain't careful. Benny's spendin', his flash, his loose talk, it started to make the wrong people nervous. Not just the bosses, but the law. The heat came down. Meetings were held. Votes were taken. I wasn't in the country by then, the government had made sure of that, but I heard every detail. Benny wouldn't slow down, wouldn't play by the quiet rules Meyer and I had always lived by. And in our business, you can survive mistakes, but you can't survive making enemies at the table. Benny's story ended the way too many of ours do, quick, bloody, without ceremony. Vegas didn't blink. The lights stayed on, the dice kept rolling, the money kept flowing. In time, more casinos rose, the Sands, the Riviera, the Sahara. Each one a palace built on the same foundation, the commission's blessing, Meyer's numbers, and the dream Benny sold. The desert became our gold mine. We didn't just own casinos, we owned the unions that built them, the trucks that delivered the food, the companies that printed the cards. Every dollar spent in Vegas, one way or another, found its way back to us. And here's the thing about Vegas, it was clean money. Or at least it looked that way. You could invest in a casino and walk into a bank with your head high. Politicians visited, smiled for photos, took our hospitality, and went home none the wiser, or maybe just richer. Vegas was the proof of what I'd always believed, organized crime wasn't about crime. It was about organization. We didn't just take opportunities, we created them. We didn't wait for the game to come to us, we built the damn table, set the stakes, and dealt the cards. From the commission room in New York to the neon strip in Nevada, it was all one machine humming smooth, feeding everyone at the table. And for a while, it felt like the machine could run forever. But machines wear down. Gears grind. And the desert remembers every drop of blood it drinks. Every storm starts with a whisper, and I could hear it long before the clouds rolled in. Every storm starts with a whisper, and I could hear it long before the clouds rolled in. Vegas was glitterin'. The commission was strong. Money was flowing from coast to coast like a river of gold with no drought in sight. But you stay in this life long enough, you learn one thing, there's no such thing as forever. The moment you think you're untouchable, that's when somebody's already got you in their sights. In the early 50s, the heat started changin', not just getting hotter, but smarter. We'd dealt with cops before. Local guys, union grifters, even the feds when they got a bug in their ear. You threw Em a bone, bought Em a steak, maybe sent Em home with a little thank you, and that was that. But now they were playing a different game. It started with the Senate hearings. Kefauver, remember that name, a Tennessee boy with a taste for headlines. He sat there in front of the cameras, all folksy charm, asking loaded questions about organized crime while the flashbulbs popped. Millions of Americans sitting in their living rooms, watching gangsters squirm on live television. I wasn't there in person, but plenty of my friends were. Some took the fifth. Some lied through their teeth. Some got too cute and wound up digging their own graves. Kefauver didn't get every answer he wanted, but he didn't have to. The real damage was done in the living rooms of Middle America. For the first time, regular folks saw our faces, heard our voices, and started thinking, maybe these guys aren't just stories. Maybe they're real. And once the public starts seeing you as the villain, the politicians start smelling blood. They passed new laws. More money for the FBI. More wiretaps. More undercover work. They started connecting dots we'd kept scattered for decades. Meyer told me once, "Charlie, information is the only thing that can kill us." And he was right. The bosses had always kept their worlds separate. The guy who ran numbers in Jersey didn't know the guy who handled heroin in Florida. But the feds were patient. They pulled at every thread, no matter how small, until they started seeing the bigger picture. Then came the worst poison of all, informants. Rats. We'd always had the occasional weak link, some low-level guy who couldn't handle prison, flipped to save his own skin. But now the feds were getting bolder. They were off-errand deals, new identities, protection. They were ton-and-made guys, our own blood, against us. It was hard to believe at first. You grow up with a man, break bread with him, stand next to him at his kid's christening, and then you find out he's been wearing a wire for 6 months. The first time I heard about a capo flippin', I thought it had to be a lie. But it wasn't. And every rat they turned gave them 10 more names, 10 more threads to pull. Vegas was still a gold mine, but even there, the cracks started showing. The Teamsters were moving money around in ways that drew attention. Politicians who used to smile for the camera in our casinos were suddenly avoiding our calls. You could feel it, the air was getting thinner. The FBI got a new weapon, something called the Organized Crime Strike Force. Whole teams of lawyers and agents dedicated to talking down the commission. Not bootleggers. Not small-timers. Us. They didn't care about arrests anymore, they wanted convictions. They wanted headlines. I remember sitting in Naples one night. I was still exiled, but I had my ear to the ground and I got a call from Meyer. His voice was tight, like he'd been holding something back for a long time. "They're learning, Charlie," he said. "They're using our own rules against us. They're following the money, not the muscle." That's when I knew we were in a new war. We'd always handled problems with strategy, patience, sometimes a little firepower. But this wasn't a war we could win with bullets. The enemy was invisible bank ledgers, paper trails, recordings you didn't even know were happening. The commission called emergency sit-downs. Some bosses wanted to go underground completely, no phones, no meetings, no paper. Others wanted to go bigger, louder, so the feds couldn't shut it all down at once. Me? I told them the truth: you can't kill a storm. You can only ride it out. But you better make damn sure your shelter's strong. We tightened our circles. Trusted fewer people. Started using intermediaries for even the smallest messages. And we watched each other, because once the rats start running, you can't assume it's just the other guy's crew. There was another problem brewing, too: the next generation. Young guys coming up in the life didn't have the same discipline. They grew up seeing the money, the cars, the suits, but not the rules. They talked too much. They wanted too much, too fast. And in this business, impatience is just another word for suicide. By the mid-60s, the feds had their hooks in deep. Vegas was still ours, but every new casino deal had to be cleaner, quieter. We had lawyers for the lawyers. Accountants for the accountants. You couldn't sneeze without signing 3 pieces of paper saying you hadn't sneezed. And yet, the machine kept running. That's the thing about an empire, it doesn't stop on a dime. Even when the wheels are rustin', the momentum carries it forward. The question ain't whether it'll stop. The question is whether you're still on it when it does. I'd seen storms before: the bootlegging wars, the street fights for control of New York, the assassinations that made the papers bleed. But this one was different. It wasn't about who had the most muscle. It was about who could stay invisible the longest. And I'll tell you something, in this life, disappearances come in two kinds. The kind you plan, and the kind that happens to you. When the tide turns red, even the calmest streets start whispering danger. When the tide turns red, even the calmest streets start whispering danger. By the late 50s, the Commission's order was tested more than ever. The fox had built a table, but the lions were restless. Young bucks, old grudges, and government pressure made the streets feel like a shark tank, and every ripple could attract teeth. It started with small things: a missed delivery here, a shady deal there. Innocent mistakes? Maybe. But in our world, mistakes often have consequences that bleed. One night, a shipment of Numbers cash went missing in Brooklyn. Nobody knew who did it, but the whispers started. Accusations flew, guns were checked, and loyalty was questioned. Every boss knew the code: respect, discretion, obedience. Break it, and you're marked. And the feds were watching every reaction, recording conversations, and probing for cracks. It was the perfect storm: paranoia mixed with ambition, seasoning every meeting with tension. The first hit came quietly. A capo in Jersey, too ambitious, thought he could expand his territory without commission approval. One evening he was found in his office, the chair tipped back, a note pinned to the desk: "Next time, ask before you move." No blood on the streets, but the message was clear: we weren't playing around anymore. Then came the bigger fish. Carlo Gambino, a calm operator from Brooklyn, made the mistake of underestimating another family. A week later, an unsuspecting courier delivered his orders, and Carlo realized the game had shifted. Hits were no longer about revenge, they were strategic, precise, and inevitable. In these years, you start seeing faces differently. A friend yesterday could be a liability tomorrow. Alliances shifted like sand. Every handshake, every shared cigar had the weight of potential betrayal. You learn to watch hands, watch eyes, listen for the quiet hesitation. And the streets? They knew something had changed. Murders that were once sensationalized became routine whispers. People learned to move carefully, eyes down, heads low. Because in the mafia, even a glance could be a signal. A nod could mean a hit. And a silence? Often, that's the last warning you'll ever get. Meanwhile, the feds were closing in. Organized crime strike force had grown. Every conversation could be intercepted. Every transaction analyzed. Lawyers and accountants tried to create distance, but the web of money and muscle was tighter than anyone imagined. Even Vegas wasn't immune. Casinos thrived, yes, but the money trail became a liability. Every contract, every union deal, every high-stakes poker game could become evidence. We learned to be ghosts in our own empire, visible enough to collect, invisible enough to avoid prosecution. The most dangerous element, however, wasn't the law. It was ambition. Young bosses, hungry for power, started thinking they could rewrite the rules. Some tried. Some failed. Others disappeared quietly. But each time, it reminded everyone that the balance we'd fought to maintain was fragile. The summer of '58 brought the biggest shock yet. A made man from Queens, loyal for years, turned informer to save himself from a tax case. The commission met immediately. Every boss sat at the table, the weight of potential exposure heavy in the room. Meyer Lansky whispered in my ear, "Charlie, you see this? We gotta tighten the screws now." We started implementing stricter rules, fewer meetings, smaller cash transfers, coded messages. The streets became a labyrinth of signals only insiders could read. Trust was currency, more valuable than gold. Betray it, and your account was closed permanently. It wasn't just strategy. It was survival. In the Mafia, survival isn't about who can shoot fastest, it's about who can think 3 moves ahead. Anticipate the law. Anticipate rivals. Anticipate betrayal. And even then, there's no guarantee. Some nights, I'd walk the Lower East Side alone. Cigarette smoke curling into the damp air, puddles reflecting the neon signs above. I'd watch men talk, kids play, cars roll by, and I'd think about the tides, the tide of power, the tide of blood, the tide of the law. All moving against each other, and one wrong step, you could drown. Blood in the water changes everything. Smell it in the air, feel it under your shoes, see it in the fear behind someone's eyes. And when you smell it, you know the hunt has started. Even the calmest streets are no longer safe. By now, I'd learned the delicate art of control. Keep your allies close, your enemies closer, and your finances closest of all. Every hit, every disappearance, every move in Vegas or New York was calculated to maintain the balance. Every action had a ripple, and every ripple could trigger waves. And the feds? They kept chasing. Every wiretap, every informant, every subpoena reminded us that invisibility was temporary. But in this life, temporary is enough to survive, to prosper, to maintain power long enough to pass it on. It wasn't glamorous anymore. The thrill of the streets, the rise of young kings, the bold hits of the past, all tempered now by caution, calculation, patience. The game had matured. And so had we. Yet even in this tension, there were moments of triumph. Deals signed without violence. Territories expanded quietly. Rivals neutralized without a gunshot. This was the art of the fox at the lion's table: precision, patience, and the understanding that control is better than chaos. The streets whispered. The feds watched. And the commission ruled. And me? I kept sittin' at the table, lightin' a cigarette, sippin' whiskey, calculatin' the next move. Every hit, every law, every casino, every man, all part of the tide. And when the tide turned red, I made damn sure it flowed in my favor. Blood in the water wasn't just a warning. It was a reminder. A reminder that empires are fragile, that loyalty is fleeting, and that survival depends not on brute force, but on foresight. The streets may be ruthless. The law relentless. But strategy always wins. Sometimes the hardest prisons aren't made of bricks, they're made of memories and mistakes. Sometimes the hardest prisons aren't made of bricks, they're made of memories and mistakes. By the late 1940s, the feds had made their move. They wanted me gone, not dead, not in prison forever, but gone. Italy was waiting for me, and New York, the empire I'd built, was 1,000 miles behind. Deportation. A punishment disguised as exile. At first, I laughed. Italy. Old country, sun, wine, familiar streets. Sounds like a vacation, right? But the truth hits you slow. You can leave a place, but you can't leave your responsibilities. You can't leave your legacy behind. And in my world, legacy is life. The ship ride was long. The Atlantic rolled beneath us like a restless beast, and I spent hours watching the horizon, thinking. The streets of New York, the lights of Vegas, the commission meetings, the hits, the betrayals, all of it replayed in my mind like a slow-moving film. Every face, every handshake, every moment of triumph and terror. In Naples, I walked the familiar alleys, smelled the familiar salt of the sea, heard the vendors shouting their wares. But I wasn't home. Not really. Home was a city where my word carried weight, where my eyes were law. Here, I was just another man in another city, respected by some, ignored by most, watched by everyone. I spent time thinking about the empire I'd built. The commission, Vegas, the networks in New York, Chicago, and beyond, all of it still running, still powerful, even without me at the table. And that was the strangest part. I realized the fox had done his job so well that the lions could survive without him. For now. Letters came from the old crew, coded messages, updates on operations, occasional requests for guidance. I responded sparingly. Advice had to be measured. Too much, and they relied on me. Too little, and the machine risked wobbling. Balance. The art of balance. I'd learned it at the table, and now I applied it from afar. Some days were quiet. I'd sit by the shore, watching the fishermen haul their nets, the gulls circling overhead. I thought about loyalty, about power, about the cost of ambition. Every empire exacts a price, and mine had been high. Friends lost, enemies made, nights spent wondering if I'd see the sunrise. The memories weren't all grim. There were moments of triumph, moments of pure genius and strategy where everything clicked, where a deal went through, or a problem solved before it became a crisis. Those memories were the ones I clung to, like a lighthouse in the fog of exile. But even in reflection, there's danger. News came that old rivals were stirring. Bosses who had once respected the table now thought they could bend the rules in my absence. Little betrayals here and there, subtle power grabs. Nothing overt yet. But the tide always turns. And I could feel it. I met occasionally with other exiled figures, men who'd been displaced by the law, by enemies, by fate. We shared stories, compared notes, laughed at what we'd survived. But under the laughter was an undercurrent, the knowledge that our pasts would never let us rest easy. Once you've walked the streets with blood in your hands, the world never forgives, and neither do you. I began writing notes, reflections, rules of the game. Not for publication, not for glory, but for clarity. To remind myself and anyone who'd listen that organized crime isn't just about muscle. It's about strategy, patience, psychology, and timing. Every hit, every negotiation, every casino deal, every whisper in the hall, it's all part of a delicate ecosystem. Miscalculate once, and the entire system suffers. Some nights, I dream about New York. Not the city itself, but the moments, a meeting in a smoky room, the clink of glasses, the subtle nods that decided fates. I'd wake up with the taste of whiskey on my tongue, the ghost of cigarette smoke in my nostrils, and a reminder that exile is a different kind of battlefield. One where you fight with memory and influence, not guns and muscle. Italy had its beauty, yes. Sunsets that painted the sky in fire, streets lined with history, the smell of bread fresh from the ovens. But beauty doesn't erase the cost of ambition. Every empire leaves scars. Some are visible, others are etched into your mind, invisible but permanent. I spent time thinking about my own evolution. From a kid in the streets hustling for every nickel to a fox at the lion's table, orchestrating a coast-to-coast empire. The power, the risk, the cunning required, it all shaped me. And yet, even with all that experience, exile reminded me that control is always fleeting. You can build a kingdom, but never a fortress. Letters from Meyer, Costello, and the Commission kept me tethered. Updates on the Commission's meetings, warnings about young hotheads, advice on handling government scrutiny. I responded sparingly, carefully. Too much influence, and I'd risk exposure. Too little, and the empire might wobble. Balance, always balance. I realized something crucial during those years: influence travels farther than presence. The fox doesn't need to be at the table to shape the hunt. The moves are made, the strategy set, and those who understand the game carry it forward. My absence didn't weaken the Commission, if anything, it forced them to adapt, to sharpen. And yet, loneliness is the constant companion of power. In Naples, I walked the streets, observed the lives of ordinary men and women, and felt the divide. They lived simple lives, worried about rent, food, and family. I lived in memories and shadows, my world built on ambition, strategy, and danger. They envied none of it, and rightly so. In reflection, I also thought about morality, not in the sense of good or evil, but in the rules that govern our world. Loyalty, respect, calculation. These are the codes that protect life in our universe. Break them, and the tide of blood rises. Follow them, and even exile cannot erase your influence. Time moved on. The empire continued to thrive, but I never forgot the streets, the tables, the hits, and the whispers. Every decision I'd made, every ally I trusted, every enemy I'd outmaneuvered, they were part of the tapestry that defined me. An exile, for all its quiet, reminded me how fragile even the strongest fox can be when removed from his den. I came to accept that my story wasn't about physical dominance anymore. It was about legacy, influence, and the subtle power of foresight. Even in exile, I was still part of the machine, a ghost in the empire I'd built, guiding it from afar. Sometimes power is measured not by presence, but by the ripples you leave behind. And in that, I found a strange peace. I had built something that could survive without me, something stronger than brute force, stronger than fear. The commission endured. Vegas flourished. The fox had done his job. And so I sat by the shores of Naples, cigarette in hand, eyes on the horizon, knowing the tides of New York and Vegas still moved to the rhythm I had orchestrated. Exile was a prison of geography, not influence. And that realization, that control could extend beyond presence, was as powerful as any bullet, any hit, any deal I'd ever made. Sometimes the hardest prisons aren't made of bricks. But even then, the fox finds a way to shape the world outside the bars. Legends aren't just remembered for what they did, they're measured by what survives them. Legends aren't just remembered for what they did, they're measured by what survives them. By the time I drew my last breath in Naples, the empire I'd built had outlived my presence, my punches, my threats, and my whispers. Streets in New York ran smoother than ever under the commission. Vegas sparkled brighter than it had when Benny first laid the Flamingo's marble floors. The fox had done his job and then some. But legacy isn't about glory. It's about structure, influence, and survival. The commission remained the backbone of organized crime across the United States. Families from coast to coast had learned the delicate art of collaboration, negotiation, and restraint, lessons I had written in blood and reinforced with strategy. Each boss knew the rules: respect the table, respect your allies, and above all, respect the flow of money. Money, the real lifeblood of power. Guns kill men, but money builds empires. From the speakeasies of Manhattan to the neon-lit casinos of Las Vegas, every dollar collected, every deal executed, every union manipulated, all of it flowed through networks I had carefully arranged. I wasn't just surviving the game, I was orchestrating it from the shadows. Even as the new generation rose, I could see their moves. Young men with ambition burning like fire, eager to make a name, eager to prove themselves. Some followed the rules, others tested them. But the principles I laid down persisted: cooperation over chaos, negotiation over bullets, and the silent understanding that a hit is always a last resort, never the first move. The feds continued their pressure, always adapting, always scheming. But my influence had built a firewall. Leaders at the table understood that while law enforcement might slow operations, it could never destroy the network entirely. The fox had left enough tracks, but also enough shadows, to protect what mattered most. And then there was Vegas, the desert jewel that had become the symbol of our reach and ingenuity. What started as a dusty pit stop transformed into a playground for the powerful, the reckless, and the ambitious. The casinos operated as legitimate-seeming businesses, but beneath the surface, the same strategies, protections, and networks that had run New York were still at work. The desert had become an empire built on discretion, intelligence, and calculated risk. I think about Benny Siegel often when I reflect on legacy. His vision was brilliant and sometimes reckless, but it reminded me that ambition without strategy is dangerous. Vegas could have collapsed, a cautionary tale of extravagance and greed. Instead, we tempered vision with calculation. The empire survived, grew, and thrived. That's the balance a fox learns to keep: dream boldly, but act cautiously. The streets taught lessons that no book ever could. Violence is inevitable, but it can be managed. Loyalty is fragile, but enforceable. Opportunity waits for no one, but strategy ensures it's yours when it appears. And while my body may have been in exile, my mind and influence traveled faster than any courier, sharper than any gun. I saw the younger bosses making mistakes, chasing attention, craving headlines. I could warn them, advise them, but in the end, survival was theirs to earn. And that's the real test of legacy: can those who follow continue to operate wisely, or will the empire crumble under impatience and greed? Some nights, I think about the streets of my youth. The alleys, the storefronts, the rain-slicked pavements reflecting neon lights and cigarette smoke. It's where I learned to read people, predict actions, and survive. Those skills never leave a man, no matter the miles, no matter the years. They shape him, guide him, and in some ways, haunt him. The lessons of power extend beyond crime. Leadership, vision, strategy, negotiation, all of these are universal. You can see it in politics, in business, even in ordinary life. The principles remain: anticipate, adapt, influence, survive. And sometimes, the quietest moves make the loudest impact. History remembers the headlines: Lucky Luciano, the gangster who controlled New York, the architect of the commission, the man who shaped Vegas. But history rarely sees the subtleties, the quiet decisions, the restraint, the patient orchestration of power. Those are the things that endure long after names fade. Influence is a strange thing. It doesn't need presence to be felt. It doesn't need recognition to be effective. The fox may vanish, but the strategy remains. The empire continues to function, to adapt, to thrive, all guided by principles planted years before, nurtured with patience, and enforced with precision. I remember the men I trusted, the alliances I forged, the enemies I outmaneuvered. Every interaction, every negotiation, every calculated risk contributed to a larger design. And that design survived exile, scrutiny, betrayal, and the relentless tide of time. Power is fleeting. Empires rise and fall. But the rules, the strategy, the structure, those can endure. That's the real legacy. Not bullets, not bribes, not headlines. The survival of the system, the continuation of influence, the ability for others to carry on the work. That's immortality in our world. And so, as I sat on the shores of Naples, watching the sun set over the sea, I could smile quietly. The fox had done more than survive, he had taught others how to survive, how to adapt, and how to wield power with intelligence. The empire was not mine alone, it belonged to the table, to the network, to the system. Even the law, with all its pressure, all its investigations, all its resources, could not undo decades of careful planning, negotiation, and influence. The commission continued to operate. Vegas continued to thrive. And New York remained under the subtle guidance of those who understood the rules I had laid down. Legacy, I realized, isn't about fear. It isn't about dominance. It's about sustainability. It's about creating a system that survives mistakes, withstands challenges, and adapts to change. Fear fades. Power shifts. Empires crumble. But strategy, foresight, and careful orchestration endure. And in that endurance, I found peace. I also found clarity. Life in this world teaches hard lessons: the cost of ambition, the fragility of trust, and the inevitability of consequence. But it also teaches resilience, cunning, and the art of patience. Lessons that extend beyond crime, beyond power, beyond life itself. I knew the streets would never forget me, nor would the empire forget the lessons I left behind. Names may fade, but influence does not. The fox leaves prints, subtle and deliberate, guiding those who follow, shaping outcomes long after he's gone. The world moves on, and so do the players. New faces, new schemes, new ambitions. But the foundation remains. The table, the rules, the commission, they persist. And for that, the fox's work was never truly done, only carried forward by those who understood the value of discipline, patience, and foresight. So, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the waves whispered their eternal secrets, I could rest knowing that the empire, my creation, my legacy, would continue. Not because of fear. Not because of violence. But because the system I built was smarter than any man, any enemy, any storm. Legends are measured not by the battles they fought, but by the structures they leave behind. And in that sense, the fox endures. Even in exile, even in death, the ripples of power continue.